Sorry?
This is on full screen.
Well, good evening everyone, and thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Gareth and Tommy and Scott for their very warm and kind words of introduction. I feel rather humbled by them. And I know they've given up time in their very busy schedules. And I'd also like to thank Heather Lumsden, who, as was mentioned, is a great-great-granddaughter of Farquhar. She and her husband have made the long trek out from London to be here especially. And I'd like to thank my publishers, Marcus and Keith, for taking on my project, and of course the input of Gareth, and as he mentioned, we've had a few interesting correspondence through email, and Jane Coe, who did the design. And last but never least, my husband Peter and children Michael and Natasha, who have constantly helped with my research and editing. And I hope this works. No? Wow. That's all right, I've just got to switch it on. Okay. Now, as Scott and Tommy have stated, Farquhar's role in British Singapore has been greatly underestimated, and my book seeks to rectify that. It explains why Farquhar's character and actions have been belittled, and presents a positive and documented account of Farquhar and his achievements. Now, you may wonder how this book came about. Well, in the 1990s, when I was researching the history of Armenians in Singapore, I was intrigued by an 1852 article which had been translated by Thomas Bradell, a very prominent Singapore lawyer, from the Hikayat of Dullah. It stated that Farquhar had chosen Singapore as a site, that he had signed the treaty and raised the British flag, and Raffles was nowhere around. Shortly afterwards, I came across Farquhar's letter claiming that he was largely responsible for Singapore's development, and then another letter downplaying Raffles' role and elevating that of Farquhar and Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal. Now, all this was so contrary to the history that I had learned that I photocopied the articles to think about later on. And that time arrived in 2006, when I was shortlisting topics for my PhD thesis. Now, knowing that the real origins of Singapore's national flower had been superseded by an imagined story, I wondered if something similar might have occurred with accounts of British Singapore's founding. Thus, I thought a reinvestigation into the roles of Raffles and Farquhar might prove feasible, and so it did. And it was further fuelled by Farquhar's epitaph. And if you look at these words here, right, talking about Singapore, which later settlement he founded. Okay. So, in my research, I turned to two contrasting types of sources: the biographies of Raffles, which aggrandized him and maligned Farquhar, and the East India Company records, plus other contemporary documents, which presented very different perspectives on the men. And it became obvious that the common occurrence of a senior official taking credit for his subordinates' work was just too simplistic. Right. The glorification of Raffles and denigration of Farquhar began with Demetrius Bolger's biography of Raffles, which was written in 1897. It depicted Raffles as a man who had risen from poverty, who was forced to leave school early to support his mother and sisters, and through his own efforts alone arose to fame. None of that was true, as my book explains. But it has become part of the mesmerising myth of Raffles. Bolger further declared that Raffles was the sole founder of Singapore and its developer, and he scathingly rejected any role for Farquhar. His views were repeated and embellished by future biographers and writers. And then, in Singapore, Raffles has been memorialised extensively, further adding to his aura. Although Farquhar's role was periodically raised in the press, defended by historians including Mary Turnbull and Ernest Chew, and more recently included in the school history curriculum, ultimately Raffles prevailed, as reprints of his biographies held sway. In contrast, Farquhar, who was Singapore's first and only commandant and resident, has nothing named after him. Farquhar Road, Mount Farquhar, and Farquhar Strait have disappeared from maps. And there's Farquhar Strait. Okay, now the overshadowing of Farquhar began with his administration in Malacca, which was derided by Raffles and hence by the biographers. Farquhar had arrived in Malacca as part of the British occupation force in 1795, and he was appointed commandant in 1803, and he ruled Malacca until 1818. A trained military engineer, he was a very methodical man, but he was an engineer with vision. As early as 1808, he drew up a draft treaty with the neighbouring sultans in order to extend British influence in the Malay Peninsula. A few years later, he advocated an invasion of Java before the Dutch reinforcements arrived, but his ideas were premature. In Malacca, Farquhar proved to be a very efficient administrator, highly praised by his superiors. His financial